Hey everyone, Michael Simpkins here. Welcome to episode 9 of the Police Instructors Podcast. Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. In this episode, I'm speaking with Kerry Avery of Odin Training Solutions, where she specializes in online, classroom, and blended delivery formats. Make sure you pay attention all the way through because Kerry has some good information to share with us, and I'll meet up with you at the end.
Bringing police instructors together, discussing training trends and more. Welcome to the Police Instructors Podcast, where industry training experts share their strategies on how to plan, develop, and design courses in a way that facilitates training retention. Bringing his 23 years of expertise as a police instructor to you, please welcome your host, Michael Simpkins.
Thank you for being here with me today, Kerry. I'm glad you're here. Welcome to the Police Instructors Podcast.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's get started by you telling the listeners a little bit about Odin Training Solutions and what makes what you offer different.
Okay, so I work purely as an instructional designer. I've been designing and developing training programs for organizations for about 15 years now. The last 10 years, I've been working strictly with law enforcement. I worked for a few agencies and on some provincial programs in Canada around investigations. And then from there, I decided to go out, set up my own business, an employee for a single agency or just for the province. Since I went out on my own about 7 years ago, I've been designing different training programs. I've worked with law enforcement at every level. I've worked federally with wildlife and environment in Canada. I've done some work on e-learning programs for some of the American companies and worked provincially on a number of different programs, e-learning, classroom, and I do quite a bit of blended learning where we're combining online and classroom for a single course. I do all of the instructional design, and sometimes I just come in as a consultant and assess all of their training and then write recommendations and give suggestions about how we can improve training. So that's most of my work. At this point in the future, I'd like to move more towards coaching and teaching more people how to do what I do and how to design solid training.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do me a favor, kind of elaborate a little bit about what you're talking about when you mention blended learning, because you mentioned you do a combination of online training, you do some blended learning, and you do some classroom design as well. So what are you talking about when you're talking about blended learning?
So when we design a program with a blended format, we usually will put some format of e-learning, so something online where they complete a module and then they come to the classroom and we continue that work. So when we do that, the e-learning component essentially pulls some of the lecture out of the class. So instead of us standing up there talking to PowerPoints, we take all of the knowledge component and put it into online learning with exercises and assessments. They complete that. Sometimes we'll even put an assignment that they complete and then they bring it into class. The concept is that once they come into class, they'll be able to spend their time with the instructor, engaging and applying all of the information as opposed to sitting there and listening to lectures.
Okay, so when you use that format, they do the lecture portion online with maybe some exercises or whatever, but they come to the classroom to actually do maybe scenario training or some kind of application process from what they learned online, correct?
Ideally, that was how it would play out.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you see law enforcement moving toward the blended format?
Definitely. I started working in this format when I very first started working with law enforcement. We created a 3-level investigation program that starts with full investigations for 18 to 24-month members, and then it goes up into more specialized courses on handling informants, writing search warrants, and interview and interrogation. And all of that was all created using a blended format, which was about 8 years ago. We're still kind of working through how to do it. But the advantage today, now that we're kind of so much further in, the technology is much better for e-learning. We're able to actually do it on our smartphones, iPads, so the access to the online learning is better. Definitely the programming software is better. And now there's quite a few companies that already host a whole bunch of e-learning. So the other option that we have arising from everything that's now out there is that we can take existing e-learning and build classroom or shorter sessions to sit on top of them. Even if we wanted to start looking at stuff like we call a parade, I guess, like the beginning of the shift when they have 10 to 15 minutes, we could potentially have people do some sort of short, something that's already online, and then discuss it in that time that they have at the beginning of shift. So we can start going to more of a micro-learning format that's a lot more consistent instead of just waiting for everybody to come in for big classroom sessions.
Oh, yeah, that's, I didn't actually think about that, but that's interesting that you mentioned that. You talking like a roll call setting where you at the beginning of the shift and kind of talk about, what's going on that day or whatever. Yeah, we call it roll call here.
Yeah, I couldn't remember what the other word is for it, because the parades is kind of our term, but
yeah. I mean that's very interesting, because I have a online instructor development class that I've kind of structured in a way. It's not blended learning, but it's structured in a way kind of like a online college class, and I could really see the value in doing that in a way, just short, maybe 10 or 15 minute learning sessions, and then, have the ability to sit there and talk about it during a roll call session. Actually, I have to think about that more. That's a good idea.
I think, and I haven't had the opportunity to do it either, but I keep talking about it when we talk about recommendations and where we think training is going to more of this micro-learning format, which is much more just-in-time training and stuff being done more when they need it, instead of piling everything on at the beginning or once a year for recertifications or whatever it is. Really, now with smartphones and all the technology we have access to, we should be developing libraries, basically resource libraries of training. Like even if you do a course like we did, a 5-day course on how to write search warrants, but we could have sort of like short 10 or 15 minute quick hitters about, don't remember, these are all like, remember, this is what's going to go into, or what you need to include in your warrant. These are the types of things you should be looking for, so that if somebody has been off in a different job and hasn't written a warrant in quite a while, that we have sort of this library of resources that they could sit down and do something for 10, 15 minutes before they actually start doing that. Ideally, I think that's where law enforcement training is going to go next, is into this micro-learning resource library format.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that would be very, very beneficial, because like you said, everybody we know carries a smartphone, right? Some people, unfortunately, like me, carry two, So you have that already available. And like you said, you're getting ready to go write a search warrant, sit down, pull up the quick training, watch it. Yeah, okay, that's what I need to do. Bam, there you go. I could see that. So let's move on to the first of a series of questions that I'm going to ask. First, is there a secret or technique you can share with our listeners that helps you think outside of the box when planning and developing learning content?
All right. Outside of the box is always a hard term, because for me, training is it's constantly evolving. Like, technology's changing it. We're getting more and more research into adult learning. Even when we look at like stress inoculation, we have research coming all the time. So I always find, like, I couldn't even tell you what box. I guess if we look at like traditional education, everyone's sitting in rows and somebody lecturing. I don't know if that's the box. I don't know. I've never seen training in a box. To me, it's sort of like this unlimited potpourri kind of waiting for us to figure it all out. That's changing as everything's changing as we go. So I'm not sure we're really in a box, but when I think about sort of my techniques when I'm planning and developing, I mean, the first one for me really is that I am constantly challenging myself to do better. I'm always reading research, looking at new techniques, talking to people, attending conferences, just so I can learn about what new. When first the online polling software came out, we were all talking about that, and now that keeps changing. So we sort of have to keep staying involved because new companies are bringing out new programs all the time with more features. And so for us, part of it is just being open to challenging yourself over and over again. As far as my, I guess, kind of technique when I'm planning is really to know your design process. We have to have it nailed down and have a system for developing. Otherwise, you spend tons of your time thinking about methodologies and what's my lesson plan going to look like and how am I going to develop this. If you have all of those foundational pieces done, then you get to spend all your time focusing and thinking about the fun stuff, I call it, the actual design. So basically investing the front end, making sure that you have a solid foundation for your training, that you know what you have your templates, you know what your lesson plan, you know your system, so that you can focus on the actual design work versus some of the documentation and sort of the other pieces around designing training.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, in law enforcement, we are kind of moving outside of that box. You said you don't think that we're actually in a box. And I think you're right about that. We're moving away from sitting in the classroom in the rows and rows of officers sitting there listening to us flip through a PowerPoint presentation or whatever. It seems like the trend now today is we're actually embracing these things. We're embracing the technology, which is, if you think about it, especially in law enforcement, we don't like change. We have a tendency to want to, we stay in a little comfort zone. But when it comes to training, we're starting to move out of that comfort zone and testing some of these theories. And I think that's a good thing. And you bring up a good point about understanding the process, because it saves a lot of time if you understand that process and you know that process. So what's one of your daily habits that you believe that contributes to your success?
So I wish I could say that I get up really early and I shut off all of my distractions and I stay focused, but none of that would be true. I know those are the things I'm supposed to be doing, but they're not the things that I've embraced yet. I think for myself, when I looked at these questions and sat and thought about them, it's really sort of my daily habit really is that I check in with myself a lot. I spend a lot of time just sitting here and thinking about my work, where all my projects are at, what do I need to get done, and whether or not my work is sort of aligning with my values. I know it kind of sounds a little bit out there, especially when I'm working with law enforcement, and it certainly is not the path to getting rich, but for me to, I guess, feel fulfilled and challenged by my work, I really think a lot about whether or not I'm maintaining my integrity in business and I'm doing meaningful work, which really is why I used to work for one of the big banks in Canada, developing national training. I've worked for utility companies, but I chose to stay with law enforcement because for me, the work is much more meaningful that I do now than trying to make a bank even more money than it already makes. Once I started working in law enforcement, I realized the difference that I had every day, understanding that my work now makes a difference in the world. And I used to always say to people, don't stress out about it. Don't get upset. It's just training. Nobody dies if we don't do our job right, until I started working in law enforcement and then realized I had to stop saying that because now somebody could die if we don't do our job right. So, but it's a layer of stress and pressure, but to me, it makes our work just way more important and meaningful. So I would say, as far as contributing to my own success, a lot of it has been checking in and basically sticking with my integrity and not selling out. I could sell out and sort of churn over canned programs and just use sort of very simple design and put it out and people would probably be quite happy with it, because we're still evolving in what people's expectations are when they come to training. But I choose not to work that way. And I think in the long run, it will pay off for